Hello, everyone, and welcome to CME Palooza. Slightly awkward beginning here as I am going to check to make sure we are actually live since we had a weird glitch last time around. Let me look, and hey, we are live. Super. All right, let me get rid of that. We can actually get started here. Yeah, apologize for the glitch in that first session. We will, I think, have it figured out, but we'll see. So, anyway. Good morning. Welcome to CME Palooza Fall. My name is Derek Warnick. I'm one of the co-producers of CME Palooza. Thanks for taking part of your day to join us today. We really appreciate it. This is our second session of the day, How CME Saved the World. Pretty bold title. I made the title and then turned it over to Kelly and said, hey, make it happen. So again, thanks for joining us. This session will be moderated by Kelly Kranis, who's Associate Director of Education at the Society of Critical Care Medicine. But before I turn things over to Kelly, a few intro slides to go over. A big thank you to all of our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Med Learning Group, PER, and Projects and Knowledge. Our silver sponsors are Peer Audience, Academic CME, ACHL, Integrity Continuing Education, Hippocrates CME, and Platform Q Health. And then our bronze sponsors, 2 pages of bronze sponsors, MedIQ, Medscape Education, CMEology, PVI, Vindico Medical Education, RMEI Medical Education, Global Education Group, Real CME, Answers in CME, Helio CME, second page, Creative Educational Concepts, Infograph Ed, Prova Education, DKB Med, Evolve Medical Education, Right Medicine, Spire Learning, Red Med Ed, CME Outfitters, and Excalibur Medical Education. 2 different ways that you can ask questions. As usual, you can use the Medscape text line, 267-6660-CME. And then you can also tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. I'll be monitoring both of those, so you can feel free to use either one. The more questions, the better. As with the first session, we'll be using Poll Everywhere again. We have a couple of audience response questions. Thanks to your audience for sponsoring that. You can either use the Poll Everywhere app, CME Palooza 005, or you can use, just type in that URL right into your web browser. I'll try to pop it up every once in a while so that you know. I think we have 3 poll questions for the day. Our speaker disclosure: any opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or a position of their employer, its parent company, or affiliates. And that is it from my slides. Just lastly, really quick, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to a good friend of mine and ardent supporter of CME Palooza, who's undergoing a medical procedure basically as we speak. So I just want to give a best of luck to her today, and I'm just seeing her texts and her questions throughout the day. But with that, I am going to turn things over to you, Kelly. There we go. So Kelly, over to you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to moderate a diverse panel of individuals and organizations that significantly impacted COVID education when the pandemic was at its worst. Right now, we're going to just have this very casual conversation discussing what we've seen, what we've done, and how it's affected the medical education moving forward. I'd like to start today and by giving the panelists a chance to kind of briefly introduce themselves and their roles at their institutions, and maybe give an example of something that they produced or helped with during the pandemic that they thought really made an impact. How about Maureen? You want to start?
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. Maureen Doyle-Scarf here. I actually work for Pfizer, and I have the privilege of leading the Global Medical Grants Program. I think that the one example that I would give that kind of floats to the top are a set of grants that we were able to execute to hospitals around the globe in the midst of the early days of the COVID pandemic that actually provided them support to rethink and retool their whole hospital intake mechanism. These were hospitals that we all saw in the US and other parts of the world where people were lining up, multiple times around blocks trying to get into the hospital for, whatever reason or whatever purpose. And part of our strategy was not just about educating healthcare professionals, but really providing grants in terms of change strategy that helped them change their system to enable the system itself and its healthcare professionals to provide care for those patients. So we have real data that shows that they were able to make a difference. I'm very proud of that.
That's amazing. How about Ryan? Would you like to go next?
Sure, happy to. So I'm Ryan Maves. I'm a professor of medicine and anesthesiology at Wake Forest University School of Medicine in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm an infectious disease and a critical care physician here, and actually recently retired from the Navy after 22 years, where I was a program director for the ID Fellowship and research director out in San Diego. I've had the chance to work on a number of projects related to COVID over the last year and a half. I think some of the biggest ones that had the biggest impact early on, and this was within DoD, but also outside of the military itself, was figuring out what we needed to do to educate physicians and other clinicians with acute care experience. So comfortable working with hospitalized patients on the wards, for example, but recognizing that we would need to all push our boundaries a little bit to be comfortable caring for patients at a much higher acuity than we may be used to. So through organizations like SCCM, through American College of Chest Physicians, and through within DoD, setting up training programs to kind of teach critical care to the non-intensivist, so that we could keep the ICU at least partially decompressed for the very sickest of patients, while recognizing that we're shifting some of that burden to the wards. I think we've done that successfully. And actually, I was just observing this. We were having our division staff meeting earlier this morning and talking about what our ICU census was here. And I made the point to my colleagues in ID that, yeah, our ICU census is X, but a substantial component of the census on the wards are patients who in ordinary times would be in an ICU. And it is partly the fruit of these kinds of educational activities, getting, I can't take personal responsibility or personal credit for the fact that the hospitalists at my institution know how to run a patient on Optiflow, right? But that kind of effort, early and sustained, I think has made a big difference in our surge response as a healthcare community.
Thank you so much. Lanny, on to you.
All right. Thank you all for having me. I'm Lanny Abnett. I'm Vice President of Education and Meetings at the American Association for Respiratory Care. Uniquely enough, I'm also a practicing RT. Up until 2 months ago, I was at the bedside. So I had the fortunate ability to work with great physicians and all other clinicians during the COVID pandemic. I think something that we did, and this is amazing, this was planning before I got here. We had planned a virtual piece of our live meeting, not really hoping we would have a live meeting. And unfortunately, we decided, since RTs are so involved in COVID, their ability to get away would be challenging. So we pivoted to a completely online meeting, and I'm very proud of the product we've created. I think, we all want it to be live, and for us, it's been 2 years since we've been live. So, when you first realize you're going to do something virtually, it's kind of a letdown because you're excited to see people, but you're also really appreciative of the ability to bring education to the frontline worker who just realistically is not going to be able to travel right now. So I think I'm just very proud of my team for just really putting that at the forefront and making a decision that was solidly based on who our members are versus what's best for us. I think I'm very proud of that in that concept. So thank you all for having me again.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. And I think it's going to be an interesting conversation because we all have different kind of views on what we did, and we all were different pieces of that puzzle that created education and kept everything moving forward in different ways. And because we were all trying to focus in with our resources that we had and what we had to do in our normal workload. With that being said, I'm going to start with the first question that I have. During the whole shock and awe of everything, how did you prepare to educate the clinicians through the pandemic? So I'm sure, Ryan, yours was more on the academic sort of how do I now take, educate the next up and coming crop of people and the other of clinicians, but also the whole concept of teaching people that are not used to being into the ICU. So do you want to kind of maybe touch on that first? Because that's kind of an interesting dichotomy of what you had to deal with versus, what probably I and Lanny had to deal with.
And again, I have to emphasize, I'm fortunate to be one member of several very large teams of people who develop these things together. And our work is just a handful of examples of the kind of work that I think the broader healthcare community all did, and CME community. I think there's probably two angles. One is, like you mentioned, how do we figure out how to bring people up to speed on acute care issues? And I'm using that as shorthand for ICU stuff, but not necessarily ICU stuff. So if you remember early in the pandemic, we would have, non-intensivists working in ICUs or providing procedural support. We had to train everyone in PPE, which was, a challenge in itself. I remember some years ago during the Ebola pandemic that the group of people who were familiar with principles of biocontainment, it was kind of a, sort of a secret hidden wisdom that a handful of people had. And now everyone knows how to don and doff. Everyone knows how to manage, entering and leaving a contaminated space. So figuring out ways to do that kind of training. So multiple organizations, like the Society for Hospital Medicine, American College of Physicians, and then groups that I've had the good luck to work with, SCCM and ACCP, were both developing tracks for, how do we bring people up to speed. So SCCM, for example, has a fundamental critical care support course, which really is explicitly to provide that kind of training. So lots of hospitals, my own included, started doing kind of crash FCCS courses for our hospitalists, for our pediatricians, for our generalists who hadn't been in a unit for a long time. So you got that one piece of it. SCCM, of course, had its series on ICU for the non-intensivist as well. But then there's the other side of it, is that the data is coming out so fast. And so, early in the pandemic, you couldn't go 30 seconds without a new trial or a new cohort study or a new piece of evidence or a new data point to affect care. And the deluge of information becomes very difficult for the clinician at the bedside to manage. And so within CHEST and within SCCM, what we found ourselves trying to be, and this was a term someone coined, it said curators of knowledge, that working with teams of experts, both at the bedside and in research, figuring out how do we distill this data down into something practical. We can go through all of the early remdesivir trials and, okay, this subgroup did okay, this subgroup did less well. How do we turn that into a package that we can rapidly and efficiently convey to our colleagues so that they can employ that at the bedside? So, so dealing with multiple webinar series, getting out, newsletters, all those sorts of ways to, within DoD, we had a weekly COVID grand rounds for the entire Department of Defense medical community. And we were pushing out this information to our colleagues as quickly as we could, in addition to drafting guidelines that are broadly consistent with the NIH's guidelines, although I will say our guidelines turned into more of a guidebook by the time we were done with it. But having a core group of people who could take the time to keep up with the data, that was probably the biggest challenge. Fortunately, these different organizations, professional societies, the military, are all pretty good at providing platforms to get the stuff out. And this is really where working with CME professionals made a huge difference, because I know how to write a PowerPoint talk. I don't know how to advertise. I don't know how to make sure that I don't know how to provide the quality control that someone who is a CME expert can provide. And then just the technical expertise involved in getting the data out there. None of that would have worked without professionals like you folks. So thank you.
Lanny, you kind of have a different view on it also, because I mean, at the beginning, well, throughout this pandemic, but really at the beginning, the whole idea of the mech vent was, at the forefront, and that's your membership.
Yeah.
So how did you, deal with this, immediately, like, oh my gosh, I'm having to do what I normally do to teach the RTs throughout the country, but now I have to teach them about this too.
For
So
sure.
it's a double whammy on a society's front, because work keeps going and it has to keep going because there's other things happening besides COVID. So how did your organization deal with something like that?
Fantastic. So I think we took the approach of right message, right time, right group, right? So we wanted to really get out there and say, let's give data and let's give information. But I also think we tried to stress that we all have to collaborate in this mechanism, right? We can't, this is not a solo effort. This is going to be interprofessional and interdisciplinary. And as RTs, we can really be on that forefront of education. I think sometimes we get a little overprotective of our things. And I think in this sense, we have to really think about how can we help teach the bedside RT to be an educator, to help that hospitalist get comfortable with managing those high flow patients. And I'll use a professional example. I worked in a COVID unit, where we were keeping high flow nasal cannula patients, and the nursing staff was very apprehensive at first. And it just took me taking the extra time to be comfortable and give them the knowledge they need, but also spending that time with any healthcare provider and saying, listen, let's just talk about this. Let's talk about progression. Let's talk about how to wean. So as an organization, I think we have learned that it's important to help our membership become that resource. I think that's the great way to put that. And I think it's constantly assessing what we need to, where we need to go from there. But yeah, I think that it's definitely a challenge, but I think we have to embrace it, and I think we have to teach our membership how to embrace it.
Now, Maureen, you have a whole other, as being with Pfizer, you had to look at this in a totally different way also, because you had to think about it as how can we effectively fund things and what's important to us, but also in relation to your organization. So I'm curious, how did Pfizer attack this? Like the fact that you feel like ethically, responsible to help with the pandemic, but also how to best fund, like you mentioned, the grants that you did at the beginning, directly with hospitals and trying to change that. But how did you come up with that's what we want to fund?
Good question. I'll answer your question as I'm sitting here listening to my fellow panelists kind of bring back all of those memories of what was going on in the year 2020. I categorize it by pre-vaccine and sort of post-vaccine. On the front end, no surprise there. I mean, Pfizer enjoys a very strategic relationship with the CME community around the globe. I mean, we have always supported, the continuing medical education arena, and I will tell you, Derek and our colleagues, the phones were ringing off the hook from various, whether it was societies, academia, hospitals, you name it, seeking funding, because all of a sudden everyone's, what we were going to be focusing on in, March through the end of the year was all blown up. There was new knowledge. There was actually not a whole lot of information that people were trying to get out. And those calls came into us, hundreds and hundreds of hundreds. So we essentially had a real-time needs assessment kind of landing in our front door. And that enabled us to very readily kind of retool our strategy and repurpose a substantial amount of funding that was going to go toward other areas of interest to be able to put out a couple of RFPs and really do, get the funding out there so that organizations like all of yours could in fact pull some of these things together in rapid fire. Toward the end of the year, however, we with the vaccine and having a better feel for this looks like it's going to go. We had a little bit of time, although not a whole lot, to start to think about, what does that strategy look like? We as a company have all of this internal data and information with respect to an actual vaccine. How can we ensure that that information is getting out into the hands of educators so that healthcare professionals can learn about this? And I'll say that we worked with a lot of different organizations in the U.S., even the ACCME, to ensure that we were staying within the guardrails of independence, but also in the best interest of patients. How can we work together in a collaborative capacity to actually get information out into the hands of the public, the healthcare professional public, vis-a-vis continuing medical education and the educators that reside within those organizations? So it was, that's essentially instant needs assessment, because all of you told us what you need, us repurposing things, but then also toward the tail end, really starting to think about, how can we maybe flip some of this stuff on its ear to ensure that those data and information are getting out as quickly as possible.
Yeah, we just had another question come in. You could kind of a little follow-up, Maureen. Somebody went out, how early in the pandemic were you able to get funding out? I can say personally, working with SCCM, Pfizer funded us immediately. And we created a rapid resource center that now today has over 1,000 pieces of content in it, which I think is pretty impressive for that time frame. But I know you guys were pretty quick to the draw when it came to, like you just said, for reviewing grants and getting things out quite quickly.
I'm don't hold me to this exactly, but I know grants were going out the door in early May, which means, and we didn't even have oh my God, we got to, this is something that we're all going to have to address until, mid-March. So, I mean, I'm thinking, 6 weeks was how quickly we got an RFP out there and got responses back, and we then executed those grants as quickly as possible.
Thanks. I'd like to do a polling question quick, please, for everyone. Just kind of curious, now versus, then versus now. Could you please rate your organization's educational response at the start of the pandemic? Was it very high at the beginning, or was your organization, this was not on the radar, maybe because of the type of clinicians that you are involved with, or maybe you had other, a strategic plan that this just didn't fall into at the time? Well, we're kind of a little all over the place. So it looks like a lot of us were on high awareness, but there was always that mid group that probably wasn't, a specialty that wasn't really on the forefront. But I think in the end, I saw a lot of groups that maybe would never have done things in this space that kind of pivoted and decided to give it a try, which I applaud everybody for that. With that, I have a question to pose. So we learned to innovate and create content faster, I think, than we've ever had to before. We've also had to learn how to update content faster than we've ever had to do before. Because a lot of times in what we do, we create things and they're out there for a year or 2 or 3. But now during a pandemic, one study can change everything. One new drug can change everything. So we were constantly having to evolve. And we had also had to learn to use our resources better because, for associations, live meetings are sometimes bread and butter. We weren't having those. So we had to be resourceful, we had to be frugal, and we also had to learn for once, which the word that we've always tried to do in CME is collaborate, really collaborate. And I think this pandemic really forced us to do all these things that we've always talked about, but we've never really jump started. So, do you think that the pandemic has actually really changed us forever? Has CME are we always going to be like this? Are we going to stay collaborative? Are we going to stay innovative? Are we going to stay resourceful? Or are we going to go back to our old ways? I'm curious. Lanny, you want to go first?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I take the approach of, the pandemic has been horrible, so we want to learn from it to come out of it, right? And I think that from our departments and our organization, we want to be better at really hearing what membership needs to know, right? And I think the great question is, how do you continually keep up with things, right? And you hit the nail on the head of how do we continually keep good information out there. And I think really what we leaned on was our membership and our volunteer sector. We have a huge volunteer sector that keeps us going, especially in the education department. And I think it's just being, it's getting a message out that's consistent and clear and appropriate. And but it all comes back to listening to our members and hearing what they need from us. I would say I look at it from a unique perspective. I think we're going to have to work a little more creatively when we come back to live meetings to sell an experience. And I know, and that's unique to say, but I think we have to sell. Our members have gotten used to kind of, hey, I can do these virtual things. So for us to get people to really engage live again, I think we're going to have to get creative with the experience. And I think once we get live the first time, how can we bring people together safely and really collaborate with them and give them that experience that I think a lot of healthcare workers and clinicians are really looking forward to. So,
Maureen, how do you think collaboration and everything's changed on your front when the grants that came in? I mean, did you see some really unique instructional designs there that you'd never seen before because of people pivoting and having to change their ways?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, just as a quick follow-up to, because I don't want to lose my thought in terms of Lanny's comments. From a funding standpoint, I not only agree with his assessment of sort of where societies especially are going to need to go. From a funding standpoint, I would equally agree that the value proposition of very expensive live and in-person conferences and congresses is going to have to be there because we now know that throughout the course of 2020, everyone was able to actually execute and get information out, whether it was flipping everything to a virtual conference or just repurposing or getting new data and information out in a way that is accessible to a much broader audience than the number of people that can actually hop on a plane and actually get to the live meeting. From a collaboration standpoint, I mean, we have always sort of highlighted and or prioritized those types of initiatives where there are multiple partners and collaborators that are coming together for a purpose. Because oftentimes, when you bring different parts and pieces together, the end result is of higher quality, has a broader reach. And I do think that we saw not substantially, and I think but we did see some very creative, innovative ways of bringing different pieces of the CME space together. I think early on, everybody was scrambling to just try to get, meet the needs of their learners. That the idea of actually coming together, which oftentimes takes some time to figure out, wasn't necessarily top of mind. But as things started to evolve, I did see more collaboration. Yes.
Now, Ryan, yours is different because as a clinician educator, and your collaborations were all over the place because being an infectious disease expert, you're being called upon from DOD, I'm assuming CDC, your institution, and also all the organizations that you belong to. So, I mean, how did you filter all, like, where's the best to, you're one human, so how is it best to spread yourself out, everything that you knew and what you could do to help?
Oh gosh, well, yes, certainly pulled many directions at the time. Not CDC, I guess, through the SCCM grant there, but yeah, with DOD and professional societies and obviously colleagues, yeah, you get pulled a lot of directions. But I think that is useful because one thing that I had to, working with my colleagues, figure out early on is where were the gaps, right? I continue to read the literature pretty voraciously. But even now that there is such a large body of knowledge about COVID, I find that early in the pandemic, I could kind of keep up with everything. But now there are parts of COVID research where I, am reasonably informed, but I would no longer consider myself, completely up to date on. And fortunately, with a large group of great colleagues, we have people who are experts in, like, for example, the oral antiviral trials that are going on with Merck, or the in Ridgeback, or some of the new monoclonal preparations that are coming out and how they work against different variants. And so I think really one of the things that made it successful was figuring out what kinds of questions our colleagues actually had so that we could craft an educational response and a thoughtful scholarly review of the available data for them. So for example, anticoagulation strategies in COVID. This is an ongoing discussion, and actually here at Wake Forest, we're still deciding how we're going to do this in light of some of the new REMAP CAP and ATTACK trials that have come out, trying to figure out what the optimum anticoagulation strategy is for folks hospitalized with COVID. That's not necessarily a question that early in the pandemic it would have occurred to me to ask as an infectious disease doctor. But my colleagues in critical care, that was very high on their list. And so that meant that as we were crafting education for our colleagues, that was the thing we knew to focus on. Right now, a lot of discussion is about what is an optimum vaccine strategy for different populations, for the immunocompromised, for patients who are moving towards organ transplantation but aren't transplanted yet, for the general population, for the very elderly, for the young and healthy. And teasing all of this together and presenting it to our colleagues, and quite frankly to myself, it certainly keeps us all busy, but but that kind of community input helps you know what the questions are, right? Because no one person, not even a small committee of people, are going to know what everyone's questions are going to be, and that has been, both a challenge, but it has also, I like to think, made us all sharper, made us better at the bedside, and happy to have been a part of it. Be a part of it. It's not over yet.
Well, Dr. Waves, you have an extra question that just came in. As a CME consumer, as a learner, what are your thoughts on virtual conferences? Are you happy with the quality, and are you looking back to live meetings in person again?
Well, Kelly and I already have a standing arrangement for when Critical Care Congress becomes live, it comes in person again, that I owe her a beverage. But in terms of, I think virtual conferences have been a good solution to the problem, and I think there's some real virtues to them. We just concluded the IDSA's annual meeting relatively recently, and there is something very convenient about knowing that I can watch some great sessions live from my living room or from my office, and that convenience element is important. But I'll also tell you, and so I think the quality of these has been really high, and I think our professional society colleagues and staff in particular have made it work. I personally think that going to sessions is not the only reason we go to conferences. The conferences are also an opportunity to meet our colleagues, to develop collaborations. It's the million sideline conversations and discussions where a lot of the real benefit of the meetings often take place. And I think we all are feeling the absence of that very acutely. And although I think the virtual conferences certainly serve the primary educational goal, and I've been very happy with them, and I am confident that we'll continue to have hybrid conferences going forward into the future. It's a real chance for people who are unable to travel to still get to benefit from new research, from new data. I am also very much looking forward to getting back to in-person meetings when it is safe.
Thank you for that. Okay, Maria, I'm going to put you on the spot next. What are some of the lessons lessons learned, wins and failures? I mean, we couldn't have done it all great. We're a fun community and we like to think we do everything perfectly, but what were some of the, maybe a win and maybe something that probably didn't go so great, or maybe we missed that we should have done, that we now looking back, a year and a half later at the beginning of the pandemic, maybe we should have done something differently, that now we can take that into consideration in the future.
Yeah, so I guess the win and the good and the bad are probably the same example. And it is one, what I think that collectively our community did well was just jump right into this and try to figure out how to meet the needs. There were so many gaps early on, and I'm thinking about this on a global scale, whether it was here in the U.S. or healthcare professionals that are starting to see patients lining up around the block in third world countries, and everybody in between. That we scrambled and really came together, I think, as a community, and did the best that we could do to get information and data, those data that we had at the time, out to the healthcare communities. I think I know, again, speaking of the collaborations, there were a lot of networks that were starting to be built that maybe didn't exist before, where information was being exchanged, from person to person, country to country. And so to me, the win is the sense of community that is represented under this umbrella of continuing medical education worldwide. I think enabled us to come together and to actually try to meet that need. What I don't think that we did so well is we weren't ready for this. And that's easy for me to say because nobody was. I don't know that we've actually learned the lessons that we need to learn to be able to respond to the next thing that happens like this. So God help us all that it's far into the future. But I feel like from our vantage point, and recognize that working within Pfizer, we're just a part of the CME community. We're not the ones that are actually developing the education. We're not the ones responsible for the learners and ensuring that we're closing gaps in knowledge. But I know that we have been running full steam and nonstop since March of 2020. And frankly, it hasn't really given us we have not had the time to go back and do a post-mortem, because as was just pointed out, we're still in the middle of this. And that to me is the not being able to carve out the time and really learn from what worked and what didn't work. And I'm painting this with a wide brush, but I don't know that any of us have had the chance to do that. extensively yet, and I think that's something that we're going to need to prioritize.
Lanny, can I post the same thing to you? Maybe, your association's, like a big, I mean, you talked about a lot of the wins, but do you think you fell short anywhere?
Well, I think that, the challenge is always going to be, getting, members and non-members want information. They want it, they want us to be, like they want to flip that switch very rapidly. And sometimes as an association, we pause a little to make sure that we're putting out the right information, that we've done our due diligence on that. And I think impatience can hurt us a little, right? Our membership is seeking that, and we're a little hesitant at times, and maybe a little slow. I think that that's a challenge, right? You don't want to put out the wrong information, and you don't want to, you want to turn membership off to your resources. And I think that the other challenge, and I think that we always think about is what's our messaging, and so we put out a supportive statement about vaccinations. That's a good example, and I think it was the right message, but we maybe had some people that were turned off by how we messaged that. So I think it's with the pandemic, unfortunately, some of the political sides behind the pandemic, it's always a challenge. You want to put out the right information in the right way, and I think that maybe is a lesson that we have learned tremendously. I wouldn't say it's a failure, but it's a lesson that we have learned on really what we do moving forward. So how do we convey messages? And I think that another example of that is, how do we move forward looking at, we were a in-person live meeting organization for decades. That's our livelihood. And then we had to pivot to a virtual meeting. And I would honestly say we probably weren't ready. And now I think we are. So I think that you can't really plan for that, but you probably should plan for that. You should learn that, hey, this could happen. And how does that look? Now that we're working on our fourth, maybe we're better at it, right? So I think that's, I guess recovery plan is a great example of that. But yeah, I think that's something I wouldn't say a failure, but I think the team was not prepared for, hey, we're going to cancel our big Congress, and now we got to figure out how to deliver content in a platform no one's ever used before.
Okay, Marie, I'm going to go back to you. And this is just something I'm just curious about, and I think maybe other people are kind of curious about, because CME, and everybody knows it has gotten lambasted in the past, of what we do, hence everything changes. But do you think because of the pandemic and us being put more into the forefront, and even pharmaceuticals, companies and biotech companies and device companies funding these things, it's given us a little bit more credibility on how we work together, and shown that what we do is valid and it's needed, and it's something, if it's done well, can really affect change in a very quick period of time. So do you think that this has changed that kind of view on us?
Yeah, yes, but I think we have some work to do. And I again, I'm going to sort of tee off of something that Lanny said, which actually is another. It's a fail. I'm going to throw it out there at the risk of it sounding self-serving, because I work for Pfizer and we manufacture one of the vaccines. But the one thing that I don't think that we did well, vaccine hesitancy has been around for a very long time. That's not, vaccine manufacturers know about it. Healthcare professionals know about it. But the fact that we have still yet to not be able to overcome that in terms of education. Now, I fully respect that there's this, it's the patient or the consumer, not necessarily the healthcare professionals, that need to be educated. But this is where I'm gonna answer your question. I do believe that this has represented an opportunity for us to really showcase and shine how, in fact, this community it empowers healthcare professionals through the education that we offer. But a lesson learned, and something that I think we need to do a better job of, is really appreciating how what that education does, translating into relative to our healthcare professionals' patients. I've been doing this for 30 some odd years. I can go back almost 30 years ago when I started asking questions about healthcare professional education and where's the patient fit into that? What about the patient education and the connection? And I remember someone at one time telling me, oh, we don't do patient ed. We're focusing on, healthcare professional education, and they're not siloed. And so our education has to do, I believe we have to do a better job collectively of making sure that we're not just closing knowledge gaps relative to the healthcare professionals, but arming them with the tools to be able to really pull that through at the patient level. And there are pockets and individuals who actually have figured that out and do a really nice job of it, and their patient outcomes are, prove that. But I still believe if you use vaccine hesitancy as the problem that we're trying to solve for, it's still an opportunity today for CME to step up and show how we are not just educators, we are true change agents when it comes to enabling healthcare professionals to practice to an appropriate standard of care. Again, long-winded, but that, I think it's there, and I think we've shown it, but I think there's still work to do. And this is a very, very real today, tomorrow, yesterday and tomorrow space where we could actually step up and change the whole game.
Ryan, you're shaking your head. Do you have anything to add to that?
Nodding. I'm nodding in agreement. No, I mean, it's exciting to hear. And this is a thing we've wrestled with, that how do we, please, not shaking my head. No,
I was nodding.
It's, we've, within different professional societies, we've talked about how do we, and vaccine hesitancy is certainly one of the ones that we're very interested in trying to address. But, a thing that I think a lot of us, it occurs to us, is you can't be good at everything, right? I like to think that I'm pretty good at educating my individual patients in my office and at the bedside. I like to think that I'm a pretty good educator of other doctors. I don't know if I or the groups I am part of have totally cracked the code on how to be advocacy organizations directed at patients for patient-specific education, other than in very focused things like, how to understand your family members stay in the ICU or things like that. The complexity of vaccine hesitancy, and as Maureen put it, it is an old problem. You can actually go online and find a scanned copy of George Washington's signed order ordering inoculation of the Continental Army against smallpox. This is pre-vaccination, this is variolation. And that caused a huge controversy and was our first great immunization debate in the history of the United States. So it goes back to the very beginning. So figuring out how do we provide that not patient-centered education for physicians, but patient-centered education directed at patients. I wonder about the skill sets and how we identify people who have that kind of expertise, because I think that, it is unlikely that messaging from Pfizer or messaging from SCCM or ACCP is going to be the thing that cracks, that breaks down that resistance. I think that it fundamentally is an issue of individual engagement with individual clinicians, with their patients with whom they've built a relationship of trust and mutual respect. And so maybe the angle that the CME industry can use to get there is teaching physicians how to do that, how to take advantage of those relationships they've hopefully had time to build. But I'm pretty sure most of my patients would, who have vaccine hesitancy, thankfully there are relatively few of them, would probably not change their mind because of outreach from industry or even outreach from a physician's organization. It's, but figuring that out, I think, is definitely going to be kind of one of the, the brave new frontiers in health-related education.
A question just came through, and I mean, we've seen it on the news and everything. The vaccine hesitancy issues internally, like in Wake Forest. Like, how are they handling? Like, are
For staff,
the vaccine hesitancy issues internally with their own, vaccinating your staff?
yeah. So we have a policy for full mandatory vaccination for all staff members. So Wake Forest is part of a larger, sort of the academic core of a larger health system called Atrium Health here in North Carolina, which is a 42 hospital system. Wake is kind of a 5-hospital province within the Atrium Empire. And it is policy of Wake and Atrium that all staff members be vaccinated. And a certain number of staff have been let go as a result of their refusal to. But and I am a cog in the machine here, so don't hold me responsible for any of these numbers I'm about to say. But I believe that both us and our neighboring health systems, our colleagues here in North Carolina, Navant and some of the others, it's been fewer than 1% of staff who have had to be let go because of that. So I think it's been a very successful strategy personally.
How about Lanny? How your organization? What is your internal policies?
So it's interesting. We actually came back this week. So staff came back on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday basis. I've been here the whole time. So what we did was, if you're unvaccinated, you have to wear a mask the whole time you're in the office and social distance. And I wouldn't know percentage. We are not mandating that as an organization. We're 33 employees, so we're a small group, but we have set those precedents. We also have signage, so if we have guests that come into the building, they know that if they're unvaccinated, they must wear a mask. We provide those face coverings. So we've been very, very upfront with that with employee and staff. So as staff came back, they've been aware of this. We've tried to really inform them on how we're going to work that out.
Well, Maureen, on to you, which is even a more interesting question since it's Pfizer.
Well, I'll be just completely straight. I don't know exactly what our ultimate policy is. I know that the vast majority, super majority of the company has been vaccinated. As soon as emergency use authorization has been obtained, country by country by country, they've immediately sent out to all of its employees, according to how the vaccine is being managed at the country level. 65 and old, whatever it was in the U.S. early days, 65 and older, anybody that was eligible could go to a Pfizer site and get a vaccine that day, and that's held true around the globe. And we, we're very, conservative organization. We know, as do most in the healthcare industry, what this disease is capable of, what this virus is capable of, and so we've been very slow to open up sites. And a lot of people, we put a vaccine out in record time and pretty much did it by working remotely. So the company's been very, been very gracious in terms of allowing people to stay remote and work remote, even though most all of us are vaccinated.
Well, I have one last question to pose to the group, and this is your chance to toot someone's horn and say something good about something you've seen. During this pandemic, was there any education or instructional design? It doesn't have to be something that you funded or even worked on. Something that you saw that you thought was amazing, that was totally, spot on, was going to do something, something that just blew you away. That was the question I didn't prepare you for. And anybody can chime in. How about you, Lanny? You want to go first?
I think that's a great question, by the way. I think just the collaboration of a lot of different groups that maybe hadn't collaborated in a long time. And I think that, and I'll say this as part of my answer to this question. I hope that we get past our siloed mentality of this is kind of ours and this is yours, because I think we've learned from COVID that it takes an army, right? It takes an army at the bedside. So in the CME world, it should take an army to deliver CME. We should all be comfortable across those spectrums. So I think just the messaging and the collaborative drive has really impressed me tremendously.
Okay, Ryan, as a CME, as a participant, did something just blow your mind? Did you participate in something or saw something that was, spot on?
Oh gosh, I mean, I've seen so much in this last year. A specific thing that really blew my mind. I think the thing that blew my mind wasn't a specific piece of content so much as it was the process, was the development of the systems for rapid delivery of information. That is what I found more interesting, that we were able to stand up these fast-moving, rapidly responsive things in response to patients' needs quickly. That's what really caught my attention.
Okay, Marie, I'm going to put you on the spot at the very end.
Well, and I'm like Ryan. I'm not going to give you a specific educational, activity or initiative example, but I alluded to this in an earlier comment. The thing that I found most fascinating is the ability for regulators. ACCME is the first one that comes to mind when we have to solve a problem because patients' lives are at stake. Everyone was willing to sort of not throw all of the rules out the window, but come together and say, okay, what is it about the construct of independent medical education, for instance, and commercial support that is standing in the way of actually getting the right education and information out into the hands of the people that need it yesterday? And to be able to see institutions and organizations that have, are so ingrained in the separation of church and state, which I'm not arguing, but also have rules and regulations in place that require, if you're going to talk about one vaccine, you got to talk about a whole bunch of other. Well, what if there's only one, and I'm the only one that is sitting on the data? How are we supposed to get that information out rapid fire? And organizations and institutions willing to sit down and figure that out so that we can solve patient problems, because at the end of the day, that's what this is about. We're educators, and we're producing or supporting education, but if we lose sight of the fact that to what end, then I don't really know what we're doing. So I'm proud of the community in that respect, of being able to come together and really try to solve those problems and not allow bureaucracy and those rules and regulations stand in the way.
Well, thank you all today. You did, I think we all had a lot of different insight into what we were doing with CME during the pandemic and are still doing. But I think we, we're able to cover a lot of ground here. So Lanny, Maureen, and Ryan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us. It's great to see everyone.
Thanks so much to all of you. I'm going to jump in here because we have about a minute until the next session. I'm going to get through these last two slides, but a huge thank you. Great conversation. That was really great. For all of you who are watching, if you could take our survey, there's a little link right on the live page. And just a reminder that the next session coming up is hands-on outcomes, what to do with data. Maybe you might need to give us a minute or two if we need to do like we did for Scott's first session. We're going to find out, but we'll see. But it'll be up very shortly. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Bye, y'all.